So my experience now was 98% men. And so I saw the same things over and over manifesting in physical ailments, and especially even powerful men, executives. When they come, they experience the same issues just because of a history of emotional suppression and nobody caring about men's emotional health. And so I decided to write a book about it.
That's fantastic. It is so true. Even looking at my own life, I can honestly say that I thought that I was healthy, mentally healthy, on target, even spiritually healthy. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Intentional Leader Podcast. This is the podcast where you hear the real stories of people just like you who become extraordinary leaders. You'll learn valuable lessons from their lives, lessons that you can apply to become the best leader you were created to be. When leaders are intentional, lives are changed. I'm your host, Sean Olson. I'm a business owner, author, speaker, and coach, and obviously the host of the Intentional Leader podcast. We're glad to have you here today. Hey, listeners, if you could help us out right away by hitting that subscribe button, hitting that like button, leaving some comments, it helps all the algorithms and helps us grow our audience. We greatly appreciate that. Welcome to today's episode. It is my privilege to have with us today as our guest, Dr. Bernadette Atanga. She is an author. She is a physician. She is an international speaker and coach. And in the last 7 to 8 months, has also become a personal friend as we've been through a program together. Dr. Bernadette, welcome to the Intentional Leader podcast.
Thank you, Sean, for having me in your forum, and it's so wonderful. The last 8 months, given what we have done together with our forum, it's been wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. So, listeners, if you want to go back to a previous episode, I had an interview with Kim Walsh Phillips and Justin Guarini, and they are the partners in the Elite Speakers Network that I have taken part in to build up my keynote speaking. That's actually where I met Dr. Bernadette. And so we've been going through that together, and she is the international speaker. But Dr. Bernadette, the big thing is the doctor aspect of this is that you had a career as a physician and now you're moving to a second career. But talk about your first career a little bit as a physician, but even more that leadership lessons you were learning as a physician.
Oh, wonderful! So, just for your audience, I was born in Cameroon and I went to medical school in Italy. And
Wow.
so, yeah, so if you remember, I kind of alluded to that when we were in North Carolina together.
Yeah.
And that is where actually some of these leadership roles and looking at leadership came into play. Because just like most people, we turn to complain about our leaders. And that
Mm-hmm.
included me. And while in our community in Italy, we will talk about the leadership of our countries, and in my case in Cameroon, and usually things that don't work. But when I moved to Italy and in our community, I started noticing that the things we complain about were manifesting in our own behaviors, in our own
Mm-hmm.
local groups. And that is when it occurred to me leadership is not only about the person at the top, but it's behavioral. The behaviors that we carry, they just manifest the same way in different environments with different
Yeah.
results. But when we look at the person at the top, whether it's our president or our corporate leader, it's easier to point to them because then it takes the focus off of us. So that's where
Yeah.
through medicine, even though I was in medical school and I look at other things, and as a physician, one of your roles is actually leadership of your team. You're always working with a
Mm-hmm.
team, nurses and medical students. So it's very important also those leadership roles. And I think leadership transcends every community. And,
Absolutely.
and and what I tell people is when I did leadership programs, I would go back to Cameroon, is that there's a leader in everybody. You are
Mm-hmm.
a leader of yourself because you make decisions that guide things that you do that affect other people, a leader of two, a leader of a family. And so I make people aware of the fact that always think of yourself as a leader before the
Yeah.
other person.
Absolutely. I love that. So, you hit on a key point. You talked about complaining about leadership, and I think that that's a common ailment across the world today where people complain about their leaders. But you made the tie back there a little bit that oftentimes what we're complaining about are things that we actually have in ourselves or see in ourselves. Can you give a story about that just for our listeners to understand how we kind of have that transference of what we see in us towards others?
Well, for example, when I was in Italy, right, because that's where the epiphany came, what we complain about our leaders about, irresponsibility, lack of accountability, and things like that. And I saw in our own meetings, we also had leadership in our meetings. And those same things happened, whether it was financial accountability or just not being the leader that they're supposed to be with whatever characteristics. And so, with that, I started learning and becoming more aware of when you're complaining about something, you have to look at yourself. Are you
Mhm.
modeling that behavior? And so early on, before I took leadership positions, like in medicine, that's one of the things I would go back. And as I learned, one of the roles I took as a leader was actually serving from the sidelines. And that's
Mhm.
because I had to make decisions, personal decisions that if I had taken more bigger leadership roles, I would have been ineffective. And so what I decided was but I grew as a leader and I would learn those skills to practice them on a smaller scale with just my small team, my nurse and I. So if they're complaining about a patient or they're complaining about leadership, because we always complain about leadership, don't
Right.
we? When things don't work, the question is, what can we do about it? One of the things I learned in that role is that most people don't realize when you're at the bottom, you see things from a different lens. Leadership
Absolutely.
sees things from a different lens. And I had the opportunity to be on both sides. And so that's where to breach that gap to know, okay, my focus at this point is looking at numbers as a leader, right? The outcome. And I don't see the strain that is putting on the team to
Mhm.
produce those numbers. And just one of the shows that I watched a lot, I don't know if you remember, Undercover Boss. I don't know
Yes,
if you
absolutely.
watched that
Love the
show.
show.
Yes. I think it was an eye opener, I think, also for leadership, because it always amazed me when the leader comes undercover and is working with the people down in the factory or whatever. They're always surprised. Why is this going on?
They are. I know.
I think that is the one of the leadership lessons is bridging that gap, not just making decisions from top down, but always finding out what is going on at the bottom. And I always try to do that with my teams.
Good. Well, you deserve some credit in that because as I'm listening to you, you've had incredible self awareness and you've been observing yourself and trying to take into account what do I bring to the table? How am I leading effectively? How am I impacting other people? And I think it's a key point for you listeners to understand that we have to constantly be evaluating ourselves and seeing how are we leading. And I like the aspect too, Dr. Bernadette, where you talked about the fact that you understood that it's okay to follow at times and it's okay to step back to the side.
I think self awareness is really important. And as you talked about, serving from the sidelines, that was very important to me because even though I didn't take on senior leadership roles early in my career here as a physician, that was also intentional to be able to be effective in whatever role I was taking.
Mhm.
And part of it was also going back to Cameroon, needing that time to then, instead of complaining about what was not going on well, I recognized that we all shared those characteristics and it was based on our knowledge base. And so, whatever I learned here, I would take it back and I would make conferences, train the traditional leaders on
Mhm.
better education and understanding of their people, because one of the things people complain everywhere is they don't, they make decisions that are top down. And so
Yep.
help them in that regard, help the church as well, and help the government leaders and some corporations. So I did all of those trainings. And people say, why do you do that? Again, it is that power of one, because
Yeah.
I had a project called the Atanga Peace Project. So it was
Mm.
about peace and it was about leadership. And part of it was peaceful leadership.
Mm.
And so, because if you understand this, because people think of peace as if, the absence of war. I said, no,
Right.
before we erupt into war, it's already brewing. And when we talk of leadership, just like, when I talk about the issue, how I got to working with men, it's about emotions, mental health. And
Hmm.
so if you think about it, there is this thing I talk about: the way we think affects the way we feel, which then affects the way we behave. So we
Absolutely.
are all fast at criticizing behavior, but we don't look at what leads up to the behavior. And so the way we feel about people or places determine how much we give or take away, how we react to them. But then our thinking, what we don't just wake up one day and think a certain way. It's education, whether it's
It is.
societal education. So it's based on what somebody told me, what about I feel, and before we get into feeling. And so it's important. That's why I bring that to people, that it's really important that we think about our feelings before our behavior. And it's going to help us at least modify, especially as leaders.
Absolutely, because leadership is influence and influence is behavior. It all comes back to the behaviors and how we're exhibiting those, and we have to be intentional with it. And I like your path of the fact that it goes from what we're thinking to what we're feeling to then we behave out of that. Most of us, we kind of flip that the other direction, right? We behave in a certain way because of what we feel, and then we think about it afterwards, but typically damage is already done. And when damage is done, it's really, really hard to recover. So, great story. And then I know you ended up in the United States. Currently, you're up in Michigan, and I assume you finished out your physician career there.
30
What
years.
brought you to the United States?
Oh, yeah. So good question. So, after medical school, you specialize, and in medical school, you go through all these different disciplines, and then
Hmm.
to choose one. And I knew I didn't want to be everything else, but when it came down to internal medicine and pediatrics, I could not choose. At
Mm.
the same time, I found out in the United States, you could do both at the same time. So that's how I got here. Unfortunately, my dream came true. I got into an internal medicine and pediatrics combined program here in Michigan, and it has been home for me for 25 years.
That
So
is
this is
awesome.
where I've worked. And after 30 years in medicine, I decided to retire and then move on to do these other things that I had been doing on the side and do them full time.
Fantastic. So I know where you are today in the sense of your speaking, your coaching. You have an awesome new book out called Beneath the Armor, and it is a book intended for men. And I want us to dive into that in 1 second. But before we dive into it, I want to understand why you wrote the book. And I'm going to ask this question specifically. You were an internal pediatric doctor into pediatrics. How and why did you end up writing a book about men and what men need to overcome to be effective in life?
Awesome. So, interesting story. So, the full title is Beneath the Armor: 8 Practical Strategies for Men to Embrace Vulnerability and Lead with Authentic Strength. And so it's a journey that again went as far back as Cameroon. So in medical school, one of the things that I realized we did not have a talk about in Cameroon was mental health. So I always
Mm.
come back to behavior. So, and again, because it affects our physical health. So yeah, you're right. So in medicine, and again, then you realize that blood pressure, your stress, your ulcers, a lot of diseases are also stress related, or
Hmm.
stress makes it worse, or mental health related, psychosomatic. So I realized then that even though we said we did not have these problems, we did. So by going back and trying to educate people, and with my experience as a physician in internal medicine, which is adult medicine, and
Mm.
pediatrics, which is
Okay.
kids, I could see how childhood issues were carried on into adulthood. And so
Wow.
my goal was to educate adults about how they were raising their children to prevent some of these mental health issues, and also ultimately physical health. And, in every society, you would hear about protecting women, protecting children. And obviously, who are the villains? The men.
Hmm.
That's the narrative. And so, of course, my education went to men's groups. But then I realized, as I was telling the stories of their children that I got from schools, the men were actually relating to those stories. And as adults,
Mm.
started bringing out their own pain. That's when I realized, oh, they needed help. So this was early and in my career as a physician here in,
Yeah.
yeah.
I love that. I want the listeners to catch something in the story you just shared there, because I think this is a really pivotal piece about you and how you've led through this. You were seeing a lot of issues with the children as a pediatrician, sicknesses, you're learning their stories because you have to tap into what's going on with them at home. At the same time, you're the internalist, and so you're talking to adults. Listeners, here's the key on this. She was able to take two different pieces and work intentionally to try to connect the dots. And the reason I love that, Dr. Bernadette, is that so many of us work through life and we just go through life and we don't stop to consider and think and connect the dots. You've connected dots in a way because you're working with both the children and the adults that allowed you to create something that is pivotal. And I believe, honestly, I think your book and with what you're trying to do with this is going to create a movement in a lot of men to really capture their role in this. And it was interesting you said that the men have played kind of the villain in these different things, or they've been seen as the villain. Dive into that for 1 second. What do you mean by that?
Well, because when we talk about domestic abuse, for example,
Mm-hmm.
it's always the women and the children are the victims
Mm-hmm.
and the men are the abusers. And so that's why we have a women's empowerment, we have children's rights. What do we have for men?
Mm-hmm.
That's a gap. So when I was doing the program in Cameroon, I started family empowerment because we are going to still have crisis if we don't empower the man to still be the leader. But
Mm-hmm.
it's just a different role because we've left men behind in their traditional roles as providers, as protectors, and then they're supposed to lead while we've changed the roles of the woman and the children to become more independent. How do you lead somebody who in their mind does not think they should follow you? But I don't think
Great
that was
point.
the intention. I don't think the intention of women's empowerment or children's rights
I
was to
agree.
leave men behind. I think it was just to end abuse, but we did not consider that even who you were considering abuse. And I think we should use that word abusers carefully because men were
Sure.
children. Men were children. If we
Mm-hmm.
so what happened to their own pain as children? And again, as society, all societies have taught men not to express emotions, whether they
Mm-hmm.
hurt. And so we created, as a society, we have to take ownership that we created the behaviors that we see in men. We asked for it by
Yep.
having them suppress their emotions. And so later on in my career here in the US, the last 17, 18 years, I worked in the VA, so which
Mm.
is definitely I didn't see pediatric
Yeah.
patients here. So my experience now was 98% men. And so I saw the same things over and over manifesting in physical ailments, and especially even powerful men, executives. When they come, they experience the same issues just because of a history of emotional suppression and nobody caring about men's emotional health. And so I decided to write a book about it.
That's fantastic. It is so true. Even looking at my own life, I can honestly say that I thought that I was healthy, mentally healthy, on target, even spiritually healthy. But it wasn't until I was the age of 40 that I began to realize that I actually suppressed everything. And I suppressed it in my life for good reasons. It was kind of more on the faith side where I took faith to an extreme of saying it's going to be okay, God's got it, instead of ever dealing with things and processing things and the emotions of it. And my life has totally transformed for the better because of dealing with emotion and being honest about it and sharing it, especially with my wife and my daughter, and truly having friends where I could say, Dr. Bernadette, I actually have friends, true friends for the first time because I was willing to be open and vulnerable. So, what you're speaking about is so true for today. I really appreciate what you said about how the empowerment of women, the empowerment of children, and helping them be strong and independent was a great thing to do, but there was an unintended consequence in that. And I think one of the great leadership principles in this for all of you listeners is we do not empower ourselves and others by disempowering somebody else. We empower ourselves as we empower others. There shouldn't be any disempowerment. And it's a huge leadership principle that you brought out as you were sharing that. Hi, everyone. I want to quickly interrupt this podcast to talk to you about something huge that is coming out in August from Renaissance Professional Coaching. It is the Intentional Leader Network. We've talked about this coming. The Intentional Leader Network, you are going to get an online course on how to become the best leader you were created to be. You're going to have bi-weekly group coaching calls with everybody in the network where you'll be learning content, you'll be given tools, and we'll even have hot seat coaching. You will have the chance to bring your questions to the table, have me coach you in real time with the entire audience listening. And one of the greatest aspects of the Intentional Leader Network is developing a community of friends from all different sectors, all different levels of leadership, learning from one another and taking that learning to the next level. If you're ready to become the best leader you were created to be, look for the Intentional Leader Network at intentionalleadernetwork.com. Join the wait list today. It launches in August. We're looking forward to having you in the network. Thanks.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think it's just a fact of life. We rise together. It just
Mm-hmm.
makes for better environment. The other thing, why men, why a book for men? I think women also we are socialized differently and we lean on each other genuinely. So I always give an example. I would say you can have two women, total strangers, sitting at the airport or waiting at the bus stop. And within that 30 minutes, they can share issues about their children, their husbands, their jobs. And just talking alone is therapy. Men don't do that. You
Mm-hmm.
can have two men who have known each other for 20 years. They play golf for 20 years. They go, if you look sad, they offer you a beer. But
Mm-hmm.
they're not going to ask you. But again, it's not that men don't care. I go back to how we raise them.
Correct.
What is he supposed to ask you? And if you tell him, what is he supposed to do with that information? So, and you've been taught not to process emotion, you don't even know what to do with yours. How can you take another person's on? So just don't touch it. And we see
Yep.
that in senior leadership, when we coming back to
We do.
leadership, we see that the most effective leaders are those who can connect and relate, not just those who command.
Yep.
But a lot of leaders think it is the command, it is the no feeling. Well, you get people to follow you and do what you say because they have to. They're afraid of losing their jobs, but you don't get the respect that should come with leadership.
Absolutely. And leadership is about respect. And when we offer it and have genuine connection, that begins to take place. Well, let's talk about the book for a second. You said there are 8 strategies. What I'd like you to do really quick is just kind of list those 8. And then let's talk about one or two that you really think are pivotal for the audience today.
Okay, so let's in random order. So one of the things is about the cry. It's important to cry. And we talk about why it's important from birth. The other one, we talk about tracking your pain. So
Mm-hmm.
there's, first of all, you have to know that you're in pain and track that. So a lot of times people think it is what is at hand. So maybe because I fought with my spouse or she wants more money, again, I say the way you think affects how you feel and how you react or behave. A lot of times the behavior is not because of what happened, it is from something else. So you track your pain. With There's another chapter about forgiveness, and there is another chapter about just letting go. And then there is another chapter about the person, just the whole vulnerability, how cultures do not allow people to express that, and men and all of that.
Those are big topics that I would say, generically speaking, men avoid or have avoided throughout time, probably even been taught to avoid, right? Strong people don't cry. That's not really the case. It's when you actually are strong emotionally, you give yourself the freedom to do that. I like those. So, two that you said there really stuck out to me: tracking your pain and forgiveness. And they stuck out to me because I think there's probably a great tie between those two things. Spend a little bit of time. Let's go deeper and have a little bit of conversation around tracking your pain.
Yes. So why it's important to know where it comes from, because a lot of times, we see the problems in leadership when we're having a crisis, right?
Correct.
Whether it's a crisis with the team crisis, but that crisis is a behavior.
Hmm.
And that behavior is what is the tool that you have been taught to use to address similar situations.
Hmm.
And so that is what's in your toolbox. So we need to go back to see how that toolbox was created. And a lot of times you recognize certain situations. So sometimes you react to people because you want to protect yourself. It's like, oh, it's like if you've been bitten by a dog, you
Hmm.
see even in a chihuahua, anything that looks like a dog, you're running away from it, not because of that dog, but because of the dog that bit you before. And so that's what we try to make people. And a lot of this is buried in childhood pain. So that's why we tell people to track. It could be societal pain, whether it was bullying from school, it could be family pain, whatever it is. And it could be a combination of things, or it could just be what life did to you, you know,
Yep.
whether you are an orphan child and whether, just circumstances of life created pain that was not expressed. And unfortunately, pain then leads to anger. And then,
Hmm.
if not addressed, and then anger now leads to other behaviors that can become abusive. So sometimes, and that's why I tell people about, patience and compassion, because you're looking at the behavior, but behind that behavior is a person and a story and a journey that if we
Absolutely.
knew, we might be more compassionate.
So true. It's amazing to me how many times, as we've been coaching leaders, we hear stories of leaders, and obviously they're direct reports oftentimes because we're coaching those leaders. And we'll open up the door for them to have effective one on one conversations and really get to know their people and understand what drives them, what motivates them. And it's amazing to me how many times leaders come back and say, had I known that about that person, I would have led them differently, right? Because they were responding as a leader to what that employee was bringing to the table, not even understanding where that behavior from the employee was coming from. But when they asked questions and understood where the behaviors were coming from, they could lead them more effectively. But processing the pain, I think that's the key thing you're talking about here, is we've all had pain. And pain comes in many different forms. And the worst thing we can do is try to give equivalency of pain, right? Because what may be a small pain to you is a big pain to me, and vice versa. But we have to process it. And that's why I'm such a firm believer in coaching, or I'll even go to the realm of counseling. We were not created to live life alone. We were not created to process pain alone. Men, especially, have been programmed to not process it and to
Exactly.
not open that up. So I'm really glad you're addressing that in the book.
That is very important. Like you say, we were not created to be alone,
No.
period. And I think you just touched on another topic for another podcast, which is loneliness. You
Yeah,
know?
absolutely. Especially in leadership, right? What's the old cliche that it's lonely at the top?
Exactly. It's lonely at the top because, but again, if you look at how we structured it, right? The organizations are structured for the leader to be lonely at the top as long as you're performing.
Hmm.
And our measure of, performance measures don't take into consideration compassion, doesn't
No,
take into consideration how well you treat your team, doesn't take into consideration those soft skills, which, I mean, things are changing now.
they
Things
are.
as people realize that emotional intelligence is quite important as much as other forms of academic intelligence. So it is important that people process their own emotions. Again, then it's uncomfortable. That I may add that though, because people hear that and you have to realize that it's going to be uncomfortable to do anything that you've been taught never to do,
Correct.
or you have not been set an example to. Because even when we go through school as physicians, life, the way our academic environment and our work environment is structured, is for competition. And a
Absolutely.
lot of times it is unhealthy competition, right? So we always reward the winner. We always reward the person that is above everybody. What the unintentional consequence, and I have seen that at work, and
Hmm.
that's why I do this work, is that some people have the mindset of to be number one, I have to work hard.
Hmm.
Other people, I have to put somebody down. so that
Hmm.
I stay on top. Those are the two ways. You either,
Right.
those are the two ways some people, they don't realize, okay, I can lead by stepping aside. I don't need this title right now. So, but we don't reward the people that help others move up. What
Correct.
do you know any award for the person that took the person that was not performing well and helped them through their struggles and made them better?
Right. Right. It doesn't exist. And
So
so the
that is
metric,
that is that is what we should be rewarding, the person that
yep.
identifies the the low performer and you
Hmm.
help them become better. That way it makes us value helping others rise, and it takes away the toxic competition.
Yep, absolutely. We use a phrase all the time in our organization as we work with our clients that our role as a leader is to help everybody else become the best version of themselves, the
Exactly.
best version of themselves, not for you to become like me, but for you to become the best version of you, tapping into your brilliance, tapping into your excellence, helping you smooth out some of your rough edges. And that's a powerful, powerful thing. So I want to talk about the forgiveness aspect for a little bit because I think forgiveness, personal opinion, forgiveness of myself and others is one of the greatest issues limiting impactful leadership today. So, what do you talk about with forgiveness in your book?
So forgiveness is very important, not just for men, but for everybody. And the reason, so if you take that as a default position, first of all, it's people misunderstand this and they think I'm not going to forgive that person because they wronged me or they never asked for an apology. If we just take a moment and think that it's a gift to yourself.
It
So
is.
it's like purging the hurt, if you put it that
Mm-hmm.
way. Okay. So it's a gift to yourself. It frees you, irrespective of what that person did and whether they asked for forgiveness. Why is that important? That person may not even be aware
Yep.
that they did you wrong. That person may have other issues themselves that clouds their own judgment, the way they think, the way they feel, the way they behave. And maybe the way they behave is really wrong, but you don't know where their thinking came from.
Mm-hmm.
And because for most people, normal is where I come from.
Right.
So what they are doing is normal. They're never going to see that as wrong the way you see it. And we find ourselves in those situations. So it's very important to have a default position of forgiveness. And I give other how that is really important. So and it just helps you your own health, your own emotional health.
Absolutely. And I find today with a lot of leaders, forgiving other people, I agree with what you said. It's for your benefit as much, if not more, than theirs, whoever the offender was. Uh, but even forgiveness of yourself.
Exactly.
People hold themselves to, I'm not even going to say a standard because standard's not the right word. People hold themselves to this position where they need to be perfect and they can't make mistakes. And we're human. We're going to make mistakes. We are going to unintentionally hurt people. If you're intentionally hurting people, that's a different conversation. But we're going to unintentionally hurt people, especially people that we're close to and love, because when we're close to people and we love them and care about them, there's more opportunity to make mistakes and hurt them. And so forgiveness to them and saying I'm sorry, but also forgiving yourself. And especially that aspect of just people hold on to things for so long, they carry burdens, and those burdens, as you were describing, those burdens become thoughts about who we are, part of our identity, which then reflects how we think, which reflects the actions that we take. And so people wonder, why are people so bitter and angry today? I think a root of it is a lack of forgiveness of themselves and others.
Yes, and you mentioned that, and the example I have in the book is also the example I gave is about self forgiveness. Also, because, and this was somebody in leadership position
Hmm.
who, in pursuing their role as a leader, ended up in a situation that was not good for them or their
Hmm.
family. So, and it becomes harder. And I think for men in particular, now that we're talking about leadership and men, it is that it's hard to forgive again, as you say. You have been groomed your entire life to be
Hmm.
perfect. and not to cry. And so to have this revelation that everything you have done has led to this problem, even though it was unintentional, or maybe what you did was right. And I say, for example, a man that has spent 20, 30 years working to provide for his family, but not being there for the wife and children. And I
Hmm.
encounter this a lot, does not understand why they are serving him divorce papers for 30 years, after 30 years, when everything he did was work and provide. So it's hard then for them to forgive themselves, to say, you know what, I was not present. I was
Hmm.
not there. So, and yeah, so it's really, self forgiveness is really, really important. And it comes also with self awareness. So if you cannot forgive yourself, then how do you forgive others?
Absolutely. And then when you forgive others, and I like that you gave the articulation, whether they're seeking it or not, forgiving others is much for your benefit. So you don't hold on, you don't create that resentment, and you don't repeat some bad patterns. So I can understand why your book is touching a nerve. I know you've been hitting some stages, talking about the book. You've had the launch of it, some signing engagements. You used the phrase with me generically that it's impacting the men. They're responding to it. What is the response that you're hearing? How is it impacting them?
Oh, so if I, the last stage I spoke on was the NAMI Michigan annual conference in Ann Arbor. And I had a man come up to me and say, I felt seen.
Mm,
Just, I mean, I felt seen. Another one said, this is really important because our mental health has been put in the back burner. And in the room was just a lot of sharing. And another woman came to me and said, my husband, who normally sleeps during conferences, was taking notes.
wow.
And then another lady said she was surprised how, by the end of my talk, men were just spontaneously sharing,
Hmm.
that she had never seen something like that. So I think, and I don't, this is not credit to me. I think when you do a work like this after years of working, I think I take this with great humility, because
Sure.
it's because of the men that trusted me, whether it
Hmm.
was in my office or in conferences, that trusted me to be vulnerable and say, we've not heard this before. Can you bring more? And so, because of them, I owe this book to them. And actually, my dedication in the book is to the men who
Hmm.
carried me towards this journey, and for the women who brought their men or brought stories of their families to give me the courage. Because it's very sensitive, let's
Yeah,
face it. It's
it
very
is.
sensitive. And that is where, when you talked about being vulnerable, so the title of the book is intentional,
Hmm.
about embracing vulnerability, but then leading with authentic strength. So there is still strength in being vulnerable, and your leadership is going to feel more authentic because you're going to
Yeah,
feel whole.
fantastic. One last question about the book. I want our listeners to catch this. Obviously, the book is written for men and it's going to be impacting men. However, I guarantee you there's a benefit to women reading it to understand. So, finish that thought. Women read this to understand.
Oh, the men in their lives and themselves. And I would just give you a share that I had from a lady who read the book. She said, reading this book, I understood my father better, and it made me question myself and my
Mm,
own emotions. So the title is for men, but inside I kind of mentioned that it's for men and women, because if you
exactly.
remove men from the title, it will apply to women. But the reason I specifically made it to men is because they don't have their own space, they don't have their own thing. I wanted them to know that somebody cares about them.
Absolutely. No, that's fantastic. I love the approach with that. Well,
Yeah.
listeners, in the show notes today, you'll find a link where you can purchase her book, Beneath the Armor. Dr. Bernadette, we always finish our episodes with the same question. It's a practical tip. What can our listeners intentionally do today to be a more effective leader?
Practice patience. Practice patience. And if you're angry, take a pause. There is a lot you see when you're patient.
Great wisdom. Great wisdom. Well, Dr. Bernadette, it's been great to have you on the show today. Listeners, all of her links will be in the show notes if you would like to reach out to her, if you'd like to book her on one of your stages. I know she's doing a tour for the book and different signings, so I'd love to have you take part in that. But Dr. Bernadette, thank you for being on the show today. Thank you for our friendship. I look forward to seeing how that grows over time. And we just wish you great blessings as you continue on this path.
Thank you, Sean, for bringing me to your listeners, and looking forward to meeting with you on our other stage.
All right. Have a great
Yes.
day.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Intentional Leader Podcast presented by Reenergize Professional Coaching. Be sure to see the show notes for links to Reenergize Professional Coaching and links to contact our guests. Now, hit that subscribe button so that you are alerted with every new episode of the Intentional Leader Podcast.